Well, hey, y'all, welcome to the When We Walk podcast, where this is a podcast where we discuss the questions we're all asking as we walk through life. I'm Shireen.
I'm Micah.
Let's chat.
So speaking of questions we all ask as we walk through life,
Okay.
I think one of the things we have encountered quite a bit because of our 4 children is trying to answer the questions our kids ask as they walk through life.
The hard dumb ones.
Yeah, there's dumb ones.
So many
there's
dumb ones.
Silly ones. There's curious ones. There's detailed ones. But then there's like really hard ones.
They do ask hard questions.
Yeah, like something from culture, something from that they pick up, observe. What's the phrase we often use? Kids are great receptors, but terrible interpreters.
Yes.
So they'll often come to you and say, hey, I noticed this. What does this mean?
Yep.
And so an example that I often think about when I think about these hard questions is in a Target in June, so during Pride Month, and Skittles this particular year, we're doing like a special version of Skittles that were white. Yeah. And on the package it said we gave our rainbow away for Pride Month. And so our kids, little at the time, came to me and were like, what's up with these white Skittles? And what does it mean that they gave their rainbow away? And there were other people in the aisle, and I felt like I was like on display. Yeah. How's this dad going to answer this question?
Yes.
So I did I played dumb. Like, I don't know, let's go over here and read the back of the package and see if it explains. And then I think I just said, well let's talk about it when we get home.
This later.
But on the spot, I didn't know how to even answer that question in the middle of a grocery store aisle.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've had those conversations with the kids too, especially when you're taken aback by it and you're like, and it's not even just now we've got to have this conversation. It's, do I have the words to talk about it? Do I even know enough and have the words to talk about it to a child? Right. And help them understand to the capacity that they need to or can. Yeah. And that is a challenge.
Try and give our children a godly perspective on things. Yep. But in a way that is soaked in the compassion of God on things. It's easy, I feel like at times, to do one or the other, to just give a very compassionate response that might not highlight truth, or to highlight truth in a way that lacks compassion. So we say around here, cross-shaped life, right? Conviction and compassion. And so being in those moments where you're trying to figure out how do I embody and communicate both conviction and compassion, and in a way that, like, if people standing around listening, whether they would agree or not, that they would at least be able to catch the compassion side of it.
Yeah, I don't know, like that there's a heart of love for people in the way we talk about everything. Yeah. And it's tough. It's tough.
And I stand on stage and teach a lot of this stuff and preach about this stuff. But in that moment, I was totally speechless.
Well, because you're caught off guard and it feels like pressure. I have to say this right, or I have to say this perfectly well. Or if I don't say it the right way the first time, my kid's going to get it wrong, or they're going to hear it from somewhere else. And again, another reason why it's important for us as adults to have these healthy conversations, these harder conversations in settings where it feels safe, where it's okay to ask hard questions, where it's okay to challenge one another, where you're anchoring your conviction in biblical truth, but you're also making sure your heart stays soft to God's love and his love of people. And I think when it starts there with us as adults first, then it will overflow out of us to our children, hopefully. So with that, so we are going to talk about a hard conversation.
We'll talk about another hard one today. So as a church, we're talking about the issue of abortion right now, because in the state of Nebraska, it is on the table and most likely going to be on the ballot in the fall. And people are going to have an opportunity to vote on abortion being either a fundamental right of every citizen of the state enshrined in the Constitution, or not in the fall. So as a church, we're talking about this, which is getting you and I stirring around, how do we not only talk well about it as a church, how do we talk about it well to all different types of people,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
To kids who hear about for the first time what abortion is. And I can remember with each of our kids.
I do too.
It's like they would hear the word and they would ask, what is abortion? And depending on their age, it's a hard concept to explain to a child because children empathize with children.
Yeah, they do.
They do.
Yeah.
And so the idea that, some parents, for whatever the reason, choose to eliminate this baby in their tummy, man, it's not natural for them to be like, okay, that makes sense. I can see why someone would do that.
No, it doesn't. I think it doesn't compute with their little brains. And I think that's something for us to learn from that, because I think God designed them that way to help teach us some things. But it is a hard conversation. It is a hard topic. I think for all intents and purposes right now, for you and me, I think we want to make sure that people who are listening, if you're listening or watching, that we want to come from a place of compassion, of understanding. I think this topic, you always have to approach it like that, because the reality is there's a good chance whether you know it or not, or know someone, we do know people who have had abortions, who have considered them, who have encouraged them, who sympathize with that leaning towards, legalized or pro-choice. And so we know that everyone's coming at it from a different viewpoint, from different experiences, and usually our experiences inform a lot of what we believe or where we land on issues. And I think for all intents and purposes, this conversation, though we might not say everything perfectly, because that's not the goal of healthy conversation around hard topics.
Yeah.
The goal is not perfect language and landing perfectly. The goal is understanding, listening to understand, listening to grow your heart. And then I think always landing in what you've said, compassion and conviction, truth and love, always connected together. And I think that's where God always wants our conversations to go, and to help guide us as we live this out in life. So I've this kind of observation that I've had over the last couple of years since Roe v. Wade was overturned, and there's been so much fire around that. One of the observations I've made is, so this was overturned in the midst of a generation who's never known life without Roe v. Wade. That's so true.
And so they've always lived in a, for the most part, pro-choice
world
environment. And to have potentially that choice taken away has been very confusing for them, even though it's just states' rights at this point. But in that thinking, our choice was taken away. And so even among circles where people value life, in Christian circles, where people would say, the sanctity of life is a big, big deal, but people should still have a right to make their own decisions, their own choices.
Yeah, because we've already had that freedom. It is hard once you've, and we've learned this with children, when you give someone freedom and then you have to take something away, it is harder. And I think that's the case with this.
So I think what we have to do as a culture is not, our baseline is not 1973 when Roe v. Wade was put in place. Was it 72 or 73? That's not the baseline.
That's true.
The baseline is the Garden of Eden, honestly. I mean, it's we were made in the image of God. Like that's the baseline. And we can't go back to the way society used to be 50 years ago on any issue.
No, we shouldn't.
25 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago.
Because we've never gotten it perfect or right.
You never have.
No.
You have to go back to the garden. You have to go back to what was lost that Jesus now came to restore. And what was lost in the garden was our identity as made in the image of God. And I believe the enemy works overtime and leverages culture and leverages our flesh to try and convince us of values that go against, they're antithetical to made in the image of God. But if you go back to made in the image of God, the issue of abortion, at least on that level, begins to be made clear.
That's good.
Every child that's conceived at the moment of conception, it is a human being who is at that point made in the image of God.
And there's a lot of scriptures that speak to that.
Absolutely.
I mean, David talks about it
Psalm
in
139.
Psalm 139. I think we see it in Mary and Elizabeth with John in the womb, leaping in the womb. I even read, I don't know, one of the prophets, God says, I chose this for you before you were even born. Like I put this destiny on you. I think it was Jeremiah. I don't remember. But basically, like I've spoken this over you before you were born, this destiny of who you will be and what you will do for me. And I think there's passage after passage about how God values life before. God knows our days before. He knows what we're going to do before. Like he has knit us together to have a purpose for life and in this world and in his kingdom right at the beginning.
Yep. So if we really do value all life as made in the image of God, then as followers of Jesus, if we actually believe this to be true, then we do have a level of responsibility to guard and keep that truth alive in our world beyond just our own individual home in which we live. But we have a responsibility to value life to the degree that we can in a culture or in a society, to advocate for life in every way.
And that looks like so many different things.
So many different
things.
I
think a lot of people, especially in the Christian world, or the way even maybe the pro-choice people look at the Christian movement of pro-life, they just see it as, it's just this political movement. We've just got to put our money and our backing and, movement politically and with laws. And there is value to doing that. But there is more to be done to value life and to uphold that sanctity of life beyond the legal system.
Right.
That just happens to be one avenue where we can have influence because we live in a country where we can do that. Yep.
And we hopefully as followers of Jesus will seek to leverage whatever influence we do have, but not overly rely on the kind of the means of the world to usher in the kingdom of God.
Right.
Ultimately, like vote the way you want to vote as it relates to life. This petition, like sign this petition that as it relates to life. But also we know that even as we do that, the end goal is not a particular law or a particular candidate or a particular limitation.
Because God's bigger than all of that, right?
Because it's an issue of the heart when it really comes down to it. Where when I hear people say, but I don't personally think abortion's a good idea. If someone were to say this, I don't personally think abortion's a good idea, but I think
I don't believe that that's God's design.
But I think everyone should have a choice. Again, and I know this is trite, but you have to remember there are two people involved in that situation. There's you and the other person who's also made in the image of God, who is now being formed in your womb.
3, if you count both parties that made the baby, if they're both involved.
And so that baby is the only one in the whole mix who doesn't yet have a voice, but very much is made in the image of God just as much.
And that we believe has the same value. So both the
mother and the child have great value. And so it's not equal to say the mother should have a choice in this situation, but the child shouldn't have a choice. And so that's where, to me, we're getting into dangerous territory where we say, as followers of Jesus, we don't personally advocate for abortion, but we do feel like choice is a good option for people who might believe or think differently, because we're edging into, this is image of God, the most vulnerable people in a society, or the unborn. And it is then beginning to edge into what you would call a culture of death, which is, at what point is that life worth protecting? You have to pick a time. If it's not conception, then is it going to be at 6 weeks or 12 weeks? or when the baby's
getting into
born.
Dangerous territory of playing God.
And then there are people out there saying, and I know people think it's ridiculous, but then if the kid has developmental issues, so cognitively they haven't developed and they're not yet a person. Now. And so is it 1 year old? Is it 2 years old? Is it 3 years old?
Yeah.
And then on the backside of life, at what point do we allow for euthanasia and the ending of life as soon as a person begins to lose certain capacities? Yeah, so it's just when you start fiddling with what life is worth protecting and what life isn't worth protecting, you're entering into a realm that is complicated. And they're not necessarily easy answers, but we as followers of Jesus want to be as close as possible to promoters of life, because that's what God is all about, rather than advocates of death.
I think that's really important. I think it's interesting to think about, first of all, I was doing some research and we were talking about this, and the fact that this has been an issue legally. We take it back to the 70s thinking it's Roe v. Wade, and it's not.
Right.
This has been an issue from, the beginning of actual civilization in communities.
Absolutely.
Like the struggle of, go back to the Bible of child sacrifices, and way early on, there were nations trying to decide, is this okay to do, to basically take control over our fertility, our decision making on, can we have babies? Should we not? Can I make this, the government has been involved in some form or fashion for a very, very long time. So this isn't new. This isn't a new issue that we've had in this way. So I think for us to think that this is just a legal battle, it will forever be. So I think it's, yes, let's think wisely about how we are, voting and looking at this issue and the ways we can get involved in the public square and help in those ways, because those laws and things do matter. But I think when you remember that this is a heart issue, and remember this is an issue of compassion and love, it should broaden the way we approach it beyond the legal system. And we should care about life and in the way that, okay, now how am I going to support and love and care for moms, families, babies that are brought into the world? And I think we have to look at it way broader than just, because the legal battle will be there forever.
There are, and there's so many adjacent issues related to this that I think, at the really root are just evil.
Right.
I think of recently Olivia Rodrigo's concerts.
Yes.
Her primary audience is middle school girls, and she was handing out abortion pills at her concerts. And what that communicates to a middle school girl is, have fun, have sex, and then take this afterwards.
Yeah.
And so there's all kinds of issues with that. You think about her target audience, you think about the messaging she's giving, you think about all that. And so you have that side of it, which is a huge issue of morality and what are our kids being brought up under.
Values, as a family.
Yeah, when we as humans attempt to remove the natural outcome from sexual union, it just opens wide.
Yeah, it does.
Basically have sex with whoever, however you want. And so there's some of the natural outcomes that would naturally limit your sexual activity in life. You remove that, and it just opens the door even more wide for immorality. But then there's the whole other side that's much more complicated and difficult, but it's so many of the women who go into these clinics, not necessarily the ones who take the pills, though there's awful stories of those as well. But so many of these women who go into these clinics are often the most poor, the most scared, the most uninformed about their options. And so they come in, and as an act of compassion, we're going to remove this problem from your life, is kind of how it's communicated to them. And in a sense, they're being preyed upon by not being given more information and more options of how they can handle this unplanned pregnancy. And we have to do better as a society there. Like we can't just enact certain laws, but we also have to advocate for systems and for care for women who find themselves pregnant and don't know what to do, don't have the resources to take care of a child. This is multifaceted and multi-layered.
And I think this is where the church can like shine.
Absolutely.
This is where
it's a great
I think God designed us to shine, is to step in as, if we believe church is a family, and to embrace the women or the families who are struggling through this season of like, okay, if I'm going to have this baby, now what? And to be brought into a family, whether it's church family or whether it's churches who reach out into the foster care system to help, or, you know, working alongside pregnancy centers who are trying to support these women or parents in these choices that they're making to keep a child. We've got to swoop in and do the hands and feet of Jesus, of loving the child and the mother and the families, and bring them into the fold and care for them and nurture them. I think that's why I have a friend who, she's such a big advocate for pro-life, like big, huge advocate, has been a part of all the things, both politically and, you know, on the just serving side. She's worked at pregnancy centers as a nurse. And one of the things she realized is like, okay, God, I've been advocating for this for so long. I actually think you're calling me to live this out. And so her and her husband stepped in as foster parents and actually took in a teenage mom who had had a baby, who had chosen life for her baby. And I think she would say it's been the hardest thing they've had to do. But she really felt like, okay, God, I want to be this advocate in this way, and not just politically. I want to do it to be the hands and feet of Jesus.
And I think that is the demographic in the midst of the debate that gets the least airtime. We kind of highlight the ones who are just vehemently pressing for abortion with no limitations, or we highlight the people who just want the laws passed, but kind of the phrase is, you care more about babies in the womb than you do about babies outside the womb.
Yeah, I've heard that.
There's kind of those two extremes that are being promoted. But my experience tells me most Christians I know who are really involved in this care about all of it. They care about the baby and they care about the mother, and in many cases are actively involved in every direction, trying to do what they can. And that's the portion that often isn't getting a lot of airtime.
No, that's true.
That's not the one that's not the solution that is being really presented by mass media. There actually is a way to address unplanned pregnancy that also promotes life. There really is.
Yes.
And we have been
it's compassion driven.
Yeah. And
it is love and compassion.
Right. And we're just being fed kind of this, these two options as though they're the only option. Either babies just need to be eliminated, or there just needs to be stricter laws.
Right. It becomes this political debate about the law over all the rest of it. And really, I think the more you go deeper, the more you realize all of it has to be driven by compassion, and it can't be this fight. Okay, so what would you say to the person who might be listening or watching, who maybe they're a believer, but they are more sympathetic to the pro-choice side? So like, I was reading something recently, a believer who had said, well, we've got to vote pro-choice because God gives us free will. We have choices. And I was like, first of all, that sounded like I've heard that before, but it feels pretty weak of a it feels a little weak to stand on that one.
Because we're given free will by God, then we should just be able to make choices. Okay,
so just
I have
vote
thoughts
that way.
on that. Yep.
So just anyone, and that's one of the reasons, but there's so many reasons that a Christian, a believer, might be more sympathetic to the pro-choice side there's a lot of different reasons, you know, whether it's medical or for most people that you talk to, it is experience. They've had a friend experience this. They've experienced it, whatnot.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So if you thought,
speak to that person?
So again, the one where it's just like, I think everyone should have a choice. We just have to recognize when our choices threaten the well-being of somebody else who doesn't have a choice, those choices need to be restricted, governed, something. And so in this case,
because we can't just live as free will as we think we want to.
You can't just steal
even
what you want
within
to
our
steal.
Free will, God is very clear.
Who you want to hurt.
Yeah, God is clear.
And we would never think that when it comes to adults, or
true.
You know, it's we because it's this silent voice. You know, in the womb, we feel like it's more justified. But you do have to realize it's made in the image of God. This person has just as much value in the womb as you do, no matter how they came to be. And so that's a hard thing to accept, but it is a truth. And so it's a different type of, it's not just a choice. Like we've kind of been fed alive. It's like it's the mom's choice, but the baby's involved too. I think for people who are just more sympathetic, what was the second part of your question?
Yeah, just maybe believers who still would say, but I am still more sympathetic to that, to pro-choice.
Yeah, I understand. So I would say, again, I'm going to always go back to conviction and compassion. Like conviction on the truth side of things is do you actually believe that when a child is conceived, it's made in the image of God? Yeah,
that we value life at the beginning, from the very beginning.
And so it has value and it has dignity and it's worth being protected. If you don't believe that, then, you know, so let me just
maybe go back to
let me
scripture.
insert this thought in how kind of warped I feel like we're getting as a society. You and I vacation in Florida a lot.
Yeah.
And there are all of these baby sea turtle nests.
Oh, yes.
On the beaches.
We talked about this.
And they've got all these markers around them, and there's these postings on them that if you mess with this nest, here's all the implications.
They're protected by law.
Here's all the legal implications. Yeah, you'll go to jail.
These
you'll be fined.
eggs are protected.
We are doing more to protect baby sea turtles.
Yes.
And so like there's something in us like where we do value life.
Yes.
It's what lives do you value? And so if we're going to do that for a baby sea turtle, what should we do for an unborn? And those are unborn sea turtles. What should we do for an unborn human? And so to me, it's so that's theologically, that's the conviction side, to say this is a life that's worth protecting. So then you shift to the compassion standpoint and say, so what do we do about it? And we have to approach this at a multi-layered approach, because it's a multi-layered issue.
Right.
Just simply creating a law. We all have seen the facts and figures. If you haven't seen them, you could check them out. That laws don't drastically shift abortion numbers. They don't. They don't. I still think we should have laws in place that reflect the value of life.
Right.
And there are all kinds of implications when you don't. But the laws alone don't impact abortion numbers. And so we have to, that's one aspect, but we have to be willing to take on everything involved in life. What happens to the baby after it's born? How do we care for the mother? How do we create situations where there's not as many unwanted pregnancies? And that's not just an issue of contraception. That's an issue of morality. It's an issue of helping young people find value and identity in the stuff that matters instead of giving their bodies away too early. I mean, you go on and on and on and on. There's so many factors involved in this.
I think someone who might be leaning that way, there might be some good introspection to be done too, not just like looking at the world around you and saying, oh, everyone should have a free choice of anything, right? Instead, maybe do some digging in your heart of like, well, is this, why do I think this way? Like, why do I think that this is how God would want all of us to live? Like, just make any choice we want, and at the expense of who and what? Because at that point, then you're pitting people. We talked about that. You're pitting one against another. Like, my free will choice actually does trump my decision to live the way I want to live, which is basically playing God. It's what we do. We're idolizing our own choice, or creating ourselves as God, and saying, my life, the way I want to live it, is more important than, this person, or living a sacrificial life, because that's really what happens when you become a parent. You are having to live pretty sacrificially. And so I think there's some good introspection to be done on, thinking about choice in general and how God views that, because I think he talks about it a lot, like the choices we make, even if he does, as he does give us free will, there are consequences to our actions. So.
And it's just not an isolated choice. It's not an isolated issue. I believe that a culture that embraces and celebrates abortion is also embracing and celebrating a multitude of other dark, evil, sad, dysfunctional activity in the society and the culture that really leads to the point of an abortion. And if we can be willing as a church to help unravel that, but as a church, it's going to take more than just a vote or a signature. It's going to take getting into how we disciple young people around issues of sexuality. How do we disciple young parents? How do we help people in marriage? How do we help people financially? I mean, there's so many things that we have to be willing to roll up our sleeves and deal with.
I do think we need to speak to one more side of this.
Okay.
So what would you say to the people who, because it can be hard when you're in the church, and especially for women who have maybe had abortions, or like I said, some that feel more sympathetic to that choice side, it can feel like the extreme right is just fist in the air. It's all about the law, like winning.
Yeah.
And it starts to lose the compassion and love of Christ. What would you say to those people who are kind of, they believe, and yes, fighting the good fight kind of thing?
Say to those people who are fighting a good fight? It's
maybe more so far that way that you need to do a little introspection on the compassion.
It's like, you've got conviction, but I don't know where the compassion is. And one without the other is a dysfunction of the other. So I think conviction without compassion is no longer conviction. It's just self-righteousness.
It's anger.
And I think compassion without conviction is actually no longer compassion. It's just humanitarianism.
Right.
And so I think they actually both need each other to define each other in context to the cross and what Jesus came to do with grace and truth. And so I think for those who are just focused on the political nature of this, you have to let your heart be broken for those who are, and think about the most desperate situation.
Yeah.
Like, don't think about the 22-year-old college kid who just wants to party and
wants to make a selfish decision,
consequence-free sex so they can have a great career or whatever. But think about the desperate mom who literally can barely pay their bills, and now they don't know if they're going to be able to make it, and their husband or their boyfriend or whoever it is who got them pregnant is no longer in the picture or never wanted to be in the picture from the first place. Think about that person. How can you navigate this situation with that person in mind, with that woman, that mother, that terrified person in mind? How do you talk about this with that person in mind? How do you talk about this with that situation in mind? How do you approach the issue? And I think allow the compassion of God to rise up in you.
You can't lose compassion.
Right.
You can't just think, and I think we have to go back to this is not a fight against flesh and blood. If we make it that, it will lead us to places, we'll point fingers at people, and we'll lose sight of God's heart. And this can't just be a political issue and a fight against people. This has to be led by compassion and love. And like you said, always remembering the broken woman or couple or baby that will need love and compassion in a family. And I think if we lose sight of that, then we will fight for the wrong reasons, and we'll make it about winning, and we'll make it about shaking our fists, and we cannot lose the heart of the Father in this.
And then the last person is the one who has had an abortion
Yeah.
And they've made it this far into the podcast.
Yes.
And they're like, what would you say to me?
Yeah.
And I think those are the hardest ones to figure out how to care for, because we don't overlook the abortion. We don't act as though it never happened, and well, you just didn't know any better, so everything's fine. And I mean, it grieves God's heart that a life was lost. And I can say this because of women who have said this to me. So this isn't Micah the man speaking. This is women who have shared this with me, that when I found the courage in the church to let someone know that I'd had an abortion, I received the healing and I felt the forgiveness of God like I was never able to experience in my own just interaction with him. There's something about
from shame and freedom from just secrecy and darkness that the enemy wants to keep you in, that God has freedom for you from that.
Yep. And you can be healed from it and fully restored and not have to carry the emotional, spiritual, mental trauma of,
and experiencing God's love in the fullness, because that's who he is.
Yep.
That's good.
Yeah. So tough issue.
Just like scratching the surface still.
Yeah. Tough issue. Hard to talk about with kids, but even hard to talk about.
It's still hard to talk about with adults. Yeah.
With adults. And we need God's grace all over all of it. And as he, the giver of life, wants to lead us to be a people who are life-minded, we got to lean into this. And
I think let this conversation just be something that maybe sparks more conversation with your friends and family, because it's an okay and a needed one to have.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for being with us, and on a unusually heavy topic this time around, but hopefully it was helpful and encouraging to you. We love you. Thanks for joining us on When We Walk, and we can't wait to see you next time.